Hi, welcome to Recogs, the Inventory Success Podcast where we discuss how the top operators source, manufacture, finance, and sell their products in order to create successful businesses. I'm your host, Mike Gelb, the community manager here at Manufactured. Manufactured is the inventory success platform for consumer and B2B companies. So this episode, it's a little bit different from our usual episodes. I know I mentioned in her last episode how different Emily's story was from the previous entrepreneurs that we've interviewed. And that's true because she started off as a retailer, Trustee as a retailer, and then molded it into a CPG brand while still Trustee being a retailer. It's pretty impressive. But this episode is actually about something entirely different. It's about Subchapter 5 bankruptcies. It's a recast of our webinar. Get it? Recast of one of our webinars where we really try to break down Subchapter 5 and how it can be powerful for businesses. What is Subchapter 5? Subchapter 5 is an amendment to Chapter 11 of the US Bankruptcy Code. It was added in 2020 to make the reorganization process much more accessible to small businesses. Now I know what you're thinking. Hey, Mike, this is a podcast about growth. This is a podcast about entrepreneurs scaling and doing well. Well, sometimes you might need to restructure your debt in order to achieve that growth. You might need to restructure your company in order to enable you to reach that growth. And Chapter 5 is a really interesting mechanism that I still don't believe a ton of entrepreneurs might not be thinking about. The goal of this webinar is to understand the ins and outs of Subchapter 5 and why it can be a great option for SMBs to reorganize their businesses and debt stacks if they need it. Now, this webinar was divided into two sections, and we'll be replaying the first section of the webinar where I interview a trustee from their perspective. This is a conversation I have with Gregory Jones. Gregory Jones is a partner at Stradley and was selected by the US Department of Justice in 2020 to act as a Subchapter 5 trustee in small business cases in the Central District of California. In that 4-year period, he has assisted in the confirmation of approximately 30 plans of reorganization, including in the cases of G-Star Inc., Upgrade Labs, GI Toys, and Laurel Apparel Group, LLC. We will also hear from Jeff Sands, who is the founding partner of Dorset Partners and specializes in turnarounds, capital, debt restructuring, and M&A. Jeff will share his thoughts, recap, and takeaways. Now, the second session, which is actually a different episode, we're going to be hearing from the debtor's lawyer's perspective. So the debtor being the brand that filed for bankruptcy. But first, this conversation with Gregory Jones, which I really did enjoy to really kind of understand the ins and outs of Subchapter 5. Without further ado, here's Gregory. Hello. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today or if you're listening as well on replay. Really appreciate it. For our webinar today about Subchapter 5 bankruptcy, I'll be your host and MC, Mike. I'm the community manager here at MFD. MFD is an inventory success platform. We help inventory businesses source, manufacture, finance your inventory. If you're a brand and looking for inventory financing or help finding vendors to produce your products, we're more than happy to chat. Subchapter 5. Now, today's, of course, webinar is about Subchapter 5. Subchapter 5 is an amendment to the Subchapter 11 of the US Bankruptcy Code that was added in 2020 to make the reorganization process more accessible to small businesses. And our goal of this webinar is to understand the ins and outs of Subchapter 5 and why it can really be a great option for SMBs to reorganize their businesses and debt stacks. This webinar has two sections. Each section should be around 30 minutes long. The first part, we'll be learning about Subchapter 5 from the trustee's perspective. And the second part, we're going to be learning about Subchapter 5 from the debtor, which the debtor is the consumer brand or business that has filed a Subchapter 5 legal representative. So we're going to learn about it from the debtor's legal representative in the second part of this webinar. For the first section, which we'll be hearing from the trustee's perspective, I will be talking with Gregory Jones. Gregory, thank you so much for joining us here. Gregory is a partner at Stradley, and Greg was selected by the U.S. Department of Justice in 2020 to act as a Subchapter 5 trustee in small business cases, and he has assisted in the confirmation of approximately 30 plans of reorganization in the cases of G-Star Inc., Upgrade Labs, GI Toys, Laurel Apparel Group are some of the names that that he's been a part of. The second section, which you'll be hearing from the debtor's lawyer's perspective, I'm going to be speaking with Joseph C. Barcelona II, who has a lot of experience representing debtors in Subchapter 5 cases. Joseph is a partner at Pashman, Stein, Walder, Hayden, PC's Bankruptcy, Restructuring, and Creditors' Rights Practice Group. And towards the end of each section, you'll also hear from Jeff Sands, who is the founding partner of Dorset Partners and specializes in turnarounds, capital debt restructuring, and M&A, to share his thoughts and recap, takeaways, and even maybe some questions as well. And as well as if you are listening live, if you do have any questions as well that you would like to know, feel free to mention the chat. We would like to make this as collaborative as possible and as helpful as possible. With all that being said, gentlemen, welcome. Thanks so much for taking the time and joining us on today's webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Appreciate it. So we'll start with this first part. We're going to start with Gregory Jones. So we're going to be hearing about Subchapter 5 from the trustee's perspective. So Greg, what tends to be the reason why consumer brands, inventory businesses, have to restructure their debt in the first place?
What I've been finding, at least in the last couple of years, there are a handful of reasons why entities find themselves needing to consider Chapter 11 relief. One thing I've seen is some of these, and these are smaller businesses, just not necessarily having the ability to feasibly determine what things are going to look like in the future and not adjusting their business accordingly. So not having enough sort of surplus to make up for bad times. Another thing that had hit a number of people were entities were interest rates going up, bad loans that had not a good rate for a period of time, but then shot up. That has affected a lot of people. And then, a number of cases I see, there's litigation. There's one case I have involves sort of a tort situation where and sort of asbestos claimants. Other places you have contracts where parties just get angry at each other and are not able to settle something. It comes up a lot. I would say in a lot of the cases I see, there's some underlying litigation that has become to a point where the parties aren't acting rationally. And so you really can't have productive settlement discussions unless there's some sort of court proceeding that causes people to spend a lot of money and start thinking about things.
Got it. No, I appreciate that. Have you also seen as well, like on the inventory side, have you seen as well as what we saw with the supply chain crunch and brands first of all being out of stock for periods of time, but then reloading on stock for long periods of time as well, and some of that stock actually ends up not selling, or maybe not selling as quickly as possible, so then they have inventory on hand that they're not able to sell. And then you obviously have maybe debts that are from since they're not getting the revenues that they hope to achieve. Could that also be a reason as well why a brand might have to restructure their debt?
Oh, sure. I mean, I've seen a lot of companies that came into existence as a result of COVID, really, and started manufacturing products to meet the needs at that time, and then completely over ordered or overproduced. And when things changed and no one needed these things anymore, they had a ton of it on hand, and there's some liquidation value to that, but given the amount that they paid for it, they just have a bunch of stuff in stock, they can't get rid of it. And so I would say I have seen.
Can you provide a brief overview of what Subchapter 5 bankruptcy is, why it was introduced in the first place, and how it differs from traditional Chapter 11 bankruptcy?
Sure. Prior to 2020, Chapter 11 cases and they are expensive. You have attorney's fees, you have all sorts of other affiliated fees along with the system. And so it became very big companies could do it because they had the money to be able to make payments to professionals and to the court system through the system. But the ABI had done research and noted that cases involving small debtors just either weren't happening or they were failing because they'd file for bankruptcy and there would just be the attorney's fees would be too much. Creditors committees would show up and nag, which they're supposed to do, but that costs money to respond to. Debtors would have to pay the creditors' lawyers out of the bankruptcy estate, so that takes time. And there was no sort debtors can move as quickly as they want to, but there wasn't really an expedited time frame. So cases tended to just sit there and linger. And the longer it takes a case to move on, the less likely I think it's going to be confirmed on good terms for the debtor. And also, it's going to cost more because you just have to things keep coming up and you have to pay for it. Bankruptcy, I think a lot is about momentum, and the quicker you can get through it, the better. So there was a need for this. So in 2020, they came up with, after years of studying, they came up with Subchapter 5. And what the idea was to have a company be able to do a Chapter 11 in an expedited manner. And so what the idea is that you have to file a plan of reorganization within 90 days. Normally, that can stretch out for a long period of time. There's no creditors committee in the case, so you don't have that expense. You don't have to pay US trustee fees. That's not a huge number, but it can add up over time. And the main way it differs, well, that's one of the ways it differs. And in order to get a plan confirmed, it's kind of modeled on Chapter 13, which is the individual reorganization chapter. So what all you have to do is no all, but 3 to 5 excuse me, is pay your disposable income, projected disposable income for a 3 to 5 year period to your unsecured creditors. And that can be your projected disposable income is you're going to come up with a budget projections and the court will approve it or not. But that's all you have to pay. And you can pay creditors off over 3 years. In theory, a 1% on account of their claims. And the big positive in a Subchapter 5 is that normally, if you're doing something like that, you wouldn't be able to keep your equity in the company. But in a Subchapter 5, it allows you to do that. So you can run up, I mean, this may sound cynical, but you could run up debts up to the debt limit and then decide, well, I'm just going to and mismanage things. And then I could pay 1%. I have a plan that pays 1% for 5 years to these creditors, which is minuscule payments. I get to keep the business. I get to keep any upside. It's hard when you look at this from a debtor's lawyer's perspective. It's a very, very debtor friendly chapter. And at least where I am, Central District, California, judges have been great and they have been interested in these cases. And when you have judges' interests, they want to try to work something out to make the bankruptcy system look successful. I mean, they're not going to do that if something obviously needs to be thrown out, but they're going to try to work on these cases to make the legislation work. So those are kind of the benefits.
Have you seen from the creditor's perspective, because since this is very debtor friendly, this legislation, have you seen it all creditors have more due diligence, for example, on companies that they actually underwrite for, or because they know that Subchapter 5 is much more debtor friendly when it comes to getting their money back?
Yeah, I haven't seen that yet. I haven't seen creditors say, "Hey, there's a possible Subchapter 5 in the works, so I better be a lot more careful in what I'm doing here." I could easily see that. Now, I have seen, excuse me, creditors, other certain types of unsecured creditors in a position where they know a bankruptcy is going to happen or it's being planned. And they know that Subchapter 5 is being planned. And so they realize at that point, wow, we're going to have to, we may have to deal with the new reality of this. But as far as going forward, and thinking of Subchapter 5, I haven't seen anyone talk about that just yet. But I mean, I do think it's something that creditors should definitely, especially when you're dealing with smaller companies that you might not necessarily trust or that don't have a huge record that you can look at.
Can you also explain on maybe some of the differences between and how and if this is maybe a big deal or not a big deal versus for subchapter 5 bankruptcy cases versus traditional chapter 11, where you actually do have a um you do have a creditor committee, for example, in traditional chapter 11, where you don't have that aspect in subchapter 5. How do those unsecured creditors get have representatives in the actual subchapter 5 cases? Is that just through the trustee?
Yeah, I mean there is a provision in the bankruptcy code that says a court can uh, put together, constitute an unsecured creditors committee upon cause being shown. Um, I've never seen that though in one of my cases. I think it's because the momentum is just not there for people, and people just don't understand that's something that they can move for. Um, what I try to do, it doesn't the statute as to what a subchapter 5 trustee should do, it has listed certain things. And I look at those and I try to make sure that I don't necessarily go outside of those things at all. I just don't, I don't want to overdo what I'm supposed to do or what Congress said I should do. But that being said, given where we are, I find that it is important for me to reach out to the creditors. There's with every bankruptcy file, there's a list of the top 20 unsecured creditors. That's something you have to file to commence bankruptcy. And as subchapter 5 trustee, I'll look at the names and phone numbers are there on the list. And so it's easy for me to reach out and call them and say, what were you doing with the debtor, and what do you think the problems are? How do you think we could possibly solve this? What do you think the debtor is real, or is this just some fraudulent person or entity that we need to try to smoke out of the process? But I really feel like I'm not a creditors committee because I'm not supposed to be, but at the same time, I really have to look out for creditors, maybe more so than is contemplated in the language of subchapter 5, just because they're not protected, and there are ways that they can get so just walked on. And I don't know if that's something that was the intent necessarily. It probably was, because they looked at it and said, okay, well, this is going to happen. But the results of some of these cases are what I consider outrageous, but I tend to be a little more pro creditor than debtor, I guess, just by who I am necessarily. I don't know. But so anyway, that's what I try to do. One thing I've noticed is that courts will, and there are certain judges in Central California have said, we want you, Greg, to look out for these unsecured creditors and want you to advocate for them. So there have been some cases, smaller ones, where you have entities that they just don't have, that creditors don't necessarily have the money to get an attorney who could show up and make the arguments that probably need to be made. I kind of see myself as having to go in there and do that, or at a minimum, talk to debtors counsel and say, hey, it doesn't look like you're acting in good faith here because of you're doing this blank, whatever that may be.
Got it. No, that's really helpful. And I guess, when you think about successful reorganization plans in subchapter 5 that have, that are approved and actually getting stated and are confirmed, what do those tend to look like then in terms of what I know this is kind of a broad question and on a case by case basis, but if you're able to from your standpoint, since you obviously value the unsecured creditors and the secured creditors, what does a reorganization plan look like that actually would be successful?
And I've had a number of plans, and I was skeptical too, because I think when you hear about, at least from the Chapter 13 perspective, which is what subchapter 5 is based on, you have a problem. A lot of times you could I mean, debtors will start making these payments and make a couple of monthly payments, and then they just won't. They'll just stop. And there's really no one there if unless a creditor reaches out and says, "Hey, I didn't get paid." And a lot of these creditors are people or entities that don't have the money or don't want to spend money on attorney's fees. Um, I was kind of skeptical going in that people were going to necessarily stick with it. But I've had, since 2020, I've had a number of 3-year plans that have made it through. I think what you have is a successful plan, at least when you're looking at a plan that I see that will last a 3-year period. You have a company that you look at the budget and you look at the projections going forward that have to be in the plan of reorganization, and you compare those to what they had done previously. You compare those to the month. Debtors have to file monthly operating reports in bankruptcies to say how they're doing and what their operations look like. You look at those projections and you see if those are consistent. If it's not just they're just out, they're promising stuff that's ridiculous. And you see if it works, and you see if the company. And a lot of times, it honestly is. You just get a read on the debtor's principal, and you talk to him or her, and you realize, okay, this sounds like someone who really wants to do this the right way. You just kind of get a feeling for it. You also, I mean, I hate to say it, but it's also the debtor's lawyer. I mean, who the debtor's lawyers are out there who are going to be responsive and able to work on a plan and not just drop everything once the case is over and just be unavailable since now they've gotten their fees. Ideally, what I'd like to see in plans is you try to have something that provides that if there's any upside that the debtor gets, say the projections are such that they do better than what their projections are, that some of that money, even though it doesn't have to under the bankruptcy code, some of that money gets paid to unsecured creditors, so that there's room for a slightly higher payment.
Got it. No, that makes sense. I mean, do you also have, I'd imagine since you've done so many cases, have a feel in terms of, lawyers that actually kind of would say maybe do right from debtors lawyers would do right by the creditors, or maybe have more trust when it comes to plans?
I mean, the central district. Yeah, it's funny because bankruptcy communities are small everywhere. And even in a place like Central District, California, which is Los Angeles, Orange County, Santa Barbara, you think it was a lot of people, but lawyers, we all kind of know each other. And you get a good feel from lawyers. I think nearly all of them file these cases in good faith. It's just sometimes, the clients that they have, or the responsiveness of those clients. And there are some firms that are just institutionally bigger and have the resources and have been able to do these cases, that they can do things a lot quickly and more effectively just because they've done it over and over again. They get it. People improve over time. And I look at what I did the first few months that I was a Subchapter 5 trustee, and I just cringe. I mean, it was just, I was what I thought was way overboard. I wouldn't do that again, but you learn over time. But I can generally, what I try to do is if a case is assigned to me, the first thing I do is I look at the judge. So you make sure that you know what the judge's local rules are and what they tend to do and what their history is on Subchapter 5. Some are tougher on debtors than others. And then you talk to the debtor's lawyer right away and see what the idea is. And then you try to reach out to the top creditors. And you also ask the debtor, is there anyone that you are aware of in this case who's going to litigate against you and going to make this more expensive than perhaps you wanted it to be?
That makes sense. What actually happens if a restructure plan isn't approved? Does it go back to the drawing board in terms of the plan, or does the case get thrown out, or kind of what actually happens?
Yeah, I think
if that happens.
Yeah, it depends on why it happens. If it turns out that I've had cases where the plan really does comply with all the provisions of Subchapter 5, but the payment just seems so low. And what a judge might do is say, this just isn't good enough. I don't think you filed this. I don't think you proposed this plan in good faith. And I've had a couple of judges do it. They both, both these judges said that it was, and I think it was right. I think he looked at the results. He said, you can do better than this. And so if it's a case like that, then it's sort of incumbent upon me to go back to the debtor and say, look, how can we structure this so creditors will do a little better? What can we do? Sometimes it's like pulling teeth, but you try to work and figure out something. So like the structure of the plan is there and it's good and it's confirmable. But a court wants you to do better. And since good faith is such a an amorphous term, that can mean kind of anything. Not anything, but it can be read and it can be used. There's no necessarily definition where you can put numbers in and say, okay, now you're in good faith. It's just sort of a feel thing. And then you have the other cases where they're filed and you look at a plan and the plan says makes projections that we can make payments in the future, but you look at their past, you look at what they've accomplished in the bankruptcy case, and you just know they can't do that. And if you have a case like that, or if you have a case where the you know the liquidation value of the debtor's assets is higher than what you would get under a plan, and it really should be in a Chapter 7, then those cases go to a Chapter 7 or they just get dismissed.
What also happens from the debts if the debt is also like there's like a personal guarantee, for example, attached to the debt? Is that then would that be outside of Chapter 11 just because that was agreed upon, or and that's the person as well, or is that like included in a subchapter 5?
Yeah, it's a good question because that comes up a lot. A lot of these cases, these smaller companies, the principals have personally guaranteed the debt. Um, if they don't personally file bankruptcy, then 95% of the time they're not protected. So the creditor, and a lot of times this is the SBA a lot, will, even though the SBA is much more, at least in my experience, much more willing to cooperate than other lenders, but um, they can go after as that. And so when you have that, that adds a whole new element that is hard because you can come up with a good plan for in this case for a debtor, but the underlying amount is still guaranteed by an individual, and that individual happens to be the person who's making the payments under the plan. And you can't really advocate for him or her because that's a conflict of interest with the company. So it introduces a lot of different factors that are difficult. I have, I am sure in some of these cases where that didn't work out with their guarantees, I would think that the parties who got the guarantee have gone after the individuals. I haven't seen it yet, but that's probably more because I'm a trustee and when the case is over, I'm kind of done.
Got it. No, that's helpful. Jeff, I don't know if you happen to have any questions as well, or any comments. That'd be if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I got a whole bunch, but I'll try not to overdo it. Gregory, you mentioned briefly that if the results are better, the payout should be bigger. How do you build that mechanism into the agreement? Is it just a percentage of free cash flow?
Yeah. It's hard. I mean, it takes some time. You got to calculate it. And in both those cases, it took a little while. But you put in if the cash flow is over this amount, then a percentage of that excess goes to the dispersing agent to distribute amongst the unsecured creditors, and the debtor keeps the other 50% as part of its operations.
Okay. And likewise, if the company's underperforming, it can't live up to its obligations, this is a question, it can repetition the court and say, hey, we're just not doing as well as we thought, and can we get a break?
Sure. Yeah, you can go back in and move to modify the plan. I haven't seen that yet, but I've seen, I mean, you certainly could. I would think it'd be the honest thing to do if you're unable to make those payments, rather than having a default called on it that just blows the whole thing up. And especially when you have assets that aren't really worth anything. So liquidation is not going to do any good. It's a tough situation if you're representing the creditors or looking out for them. But you say this is the reality. We're going to have to get a lower payment. So let's work with them and get it done. Because I think once you get to that point, you really want to try to preserve the plan because you've really worked hard to get to that point.
Yeah, I got another quick question. The 3 to 5 year, I've seen where it seems like the default is 3, even if the creditors can get a full recovery by year 4. The courts seem to be really happy with a 3-year payout. Is that it?
Yeah, there's not a lot of case law on that. It's new, so but I have I mean, in fact, right before this call, I was talking to some creditors in a case about the length of the plan, and apparently there's a decision in Georgia I want to look at after this to see what factors they look at. But at least what I've done, a court will use the 3 to 5 year period to and look at it from the creditor's perspective. So the court will generally say, what's better for creditors, 3 or 5 years? There's no real basis for that, but I tend to agree with that. So that's kind of how it's worked.
I got one more, if I may. We recently filed a subchapter 5. The debt was over to 7.5, but a lot of it was MCA debt, on the thesis that MCAs play both sides of the coin, whether they're lenders or buyers of receivables. That and the fact that we assume most judges hate MCAs at this point, we didn't count the MCA as debt, got under to 7.5 and have stayed in. Have you seen that before? Is that somewhat typical?
I haven't seen necessarily that, but I've seen some situations where what people try to do is you have a lot of debt, but insider debt doesn't count towards the limit. So if you have an insider who is willing to do this, has enough money, they'll just buy off all those creditors. Then you get under the debt limit, and then you're able to use subchapter 5 for the purposes of reorganizing. I have found that courts are generally pretty easy on that, at least thus far, on the eligibility, unless it's something that's just blatantly wrong. The court will consider to try to get it into a sub 5.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Sure.
Do you also ever come across companies to your earlier points where maybe the assets just aren't there, or it doesn't make sense to even file a subchapter 5, whereas it might make more sense for a chapter 7 just because the assets that they actually have and the company doesn't make sense to actually move on with the company?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, the first thing I ask is, even when I look at a debtor company or you look at subchapter 5 cases, what's your story, and what do you want to accomplish for the future? Do you see yourself in this business, in 3 to 5 years doing it? What do you think you can do? I mean, you could file a sub 5 with no real assets. And I've been a trustee for a handful of law firms that filed sub 5. And other than receivables, they don't have much. So liquidation value, that is not much at all. So, but if they have an idea and they think they can generate disposable income to pay off in 3 to 5 years, they'll do it. I mean, it makes sense. There are other cases though where you look at the value of the assets that they have, and you see how much you could liquidate that for, and what's owed. And you'd say, just unless you really want to keep this business going, just sell it. You don't even have to need to file a 7. You could just try to dissolve under state law. Although 7s, are a way to also accomplish that goal.
Gregory, this was so great. Thanks so much.
Thank
you so much for your set.
Thank you for the opportunity. I love talking about it.
And Jeff, thanks so much for your questions. Amazing questions. Really appreciate it. And there you have it. I hope that was helpful in understanding what Chapter 5 is and why it was introduced. Also, what the maximum debt you can actually have, what that cap is in order to qualify for Subchapter 5, why it may make sense, why it may not make sense as an instrument in order to recap your debt. Thanks for listening. Again, this is brought to you by Manufactured. We try to produce helpful content. We really hope that this content's helpful in order for you to achieve your business goals from an operations perspective. Not only do we produce content, we also throw events. We throw events around the country. Check us out at manufactured.com/events. Our goal is to help bring together the consumer ecosystem through events, through community, through content. We really hope you enjoy. What Manufactured does is we're an inventory success platform for consumer brands. We help finance inventory. We can help reduce COGs. We also can help distribute inventory across new sales channels. If you do want to learn more, check out mfd.com. Thank you.